Welcome, and thank you for joining us here in this virtual space. I am Jane Koster, President of the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island. We are proud to partner tonight with Common Cause Rhode Island and the Providence Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta to present the panel discussion on redistricting processes. This event is part of the League of Women Voters People-Powered Fair Maps campaign, a national movement fighting for fair maps and fair representation at all levels. Today is the PPFM National Day of Action, and we're excited to help raise awareness and educate voters on redistricting. It is the practice of the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island to acknowledge that the grounds from which we gather are Indigenous lands. Our offices in Providence are on the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Nation. We recognize and honor the continued existence and contributions of Indigenous people to our society. I would like now to introduce the moderator and the hosts tonight discussion, Ian Donnis. Ian has been the political reporter for what is now called the Public's Radio since 2009. In 1999, he started working at the Providence Phoenix 2 weeks before the FBI raided City Hall in the Plunder Dome investigation. Ian has also worked for the Associated Press and the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. Ian.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. Redistricting has obviously been in the news this week with the surprising development that we will be keeping both of our congressional districts. There was kind of an unofficial joke among us political reporters in Rhode Island that in recent years, if you were to ask either of the state's two congressmen, Jim Langevin or David Cicilline, what were they going to do when, with this expected outcome that Rodon was going to lose one of its two congressional seats? And, you know, whether it was 2 years ago or a year ago or 6 months ago, the answer was always the same. You know, I don't think about that. I don't think about my political future. That's so far away. This was obviously pretty silly because politicians are very focused on their political futures. Congressman Cicilline lifted the veil from his intentions when he put out an aggressive statement on his fundraising about a week or two ago. But as it turns out, the two congressmen will have the opportunity, at least for the near future, to run for their seats once again. And redistricting is a very important thing. As we'll hear from our panel, it has to do with what kind of federal resources Rhode Island gets from the federal government. The question of population funnels directly into that. It's also there's also some regional pride of authorship for elements of redistricting. The term gerrymandering stems from a former Massachusetts politician, Elbridge Gerry, and I'm sure perhaps John Marion or one of our other panelists will get into that. But without further ado, I have the pleasure of welcoming four very knowledgeable and well-respected individuals, each with a different perspective and expertise on the topic of redistricting. We have State Representative Jason Knight, who's represented District 67 as a Democrat in Barrington and Warren since first winning election in 2016. He was named a deputy majority leader in January. Representative Knight is the second vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and he chairs the House Oversight Committee's Administrative Efficiency Subcommittee. He's a member of the House Environment and Natural Resources Committee and the House State Government and Elections Committee. Jason is a U.S. Navy veteran and a current attorney in private practice. Also with us is Ray Rickman, a former state representative from the Brown University area of Providence. He served as a Rodon Deputy Secretary of State from 2000 to 2002. the highest office held by an African American in the state's history. Ray is currently the executive director of Stages of Freedom, a nonprofit he co-founded that teaches swimming to children of color and provides African American cultural programs to Rhode Islanders of all races. Next, say hello to John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, the nonpartisan good government group. John has been in that role since 2008, serving as the organization's chief legislative advocate and spokesperson in Rhode Island. He's led successful legislative campaigns to reform the state's campaign finance disclosure system, restore full jurisdiction of the Ethics Commission over members of the General Assembly, and create a system of risk limiting post-election audits. John has also served on the Rhode Island Complete Count Committee to help ensure that every Rhode Islander was counted in the 2020 census. Last but not least, we have the pleasure of welcoming Rochelle Lee, League of Women Voters member and Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission of Rhode Island and the Providence Housing Authority. Rochelle serves as board president of the Southside Community Land Trust and board secretary for the Providence Community Library, Transit Authority, and she's formerly been the president of the Rhode Island Association of Fundraising Professionals, as well as board secretary and vice chair of RIPTA. She was a 3-term elected Ward 9 and Senate District 2 committee member. Rochelle is a member of various organizations promoting access to healthy food, living wage jobs, low-cost housing, youth and family programs, access for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to healthcare, women's rights, anti-racism, and grassroots voter initiatives. So let's begin with our conversation tonight, discussing a little bit of Redistricting 101. John Marion, why don't you start us off? Tell us about the difference between redistricting and reapportionment.
Sure. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to our co-sponsors for tonight's event, and particularly Dixie Sampson of the League for doing the yeoman's work organizing this. Yeah, you probably heard the term reapportionment this week, and that's really the purpose of the census that took place in 2020. It's the process of counting everybody in the United States and then allocating them to their states. So we found out that the total population of Rhode Island was just under 1.1 million people this week. And as a result, we were apportioned to congressional districts. And each state gets a set number of districts based on formula you might hear a little bit about later. There's going to be another apportionment process that occurs later this year. We're going to find out more granular data about where people live in Rhode Island, and we're going to apportion the seats in our state legislature, the General Assembly. And we do this process because in the 1960s, the US Supreme Court, through a series of decisions, said that legislative districts have to have near equal population. And for state legislative districts, that means plus or minus 5% population deviation. And for congressional districts, it's plus or minus 1%. So they have to have almost equal numbers of people in them. Redistricting is where then you choose to draw the lines among those people. And that's more of a political process, as you're going to hear tonight. And there's a term called gerrymandering we're going to talk about when that process sometimes is abused. But think of apportionment as sort of dividing the population into equal piles or equal sizes. But then redistricting is sort of how you cut the edges. And there's a lot of business that can happen in that cutting of the edges.
Well, speaking of that business of baking the cake of redistricting, Jason Knight, how did it turn out that we were all surprised and that Rhode Island is winding up keeping 2 congressional districts rather than going down to 1?
Well, Ian, I first I also want to say thank you to the league and Dixie for organizing this tonight. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the ins and outs of how you cut these districts and how you find out where the people are. You know, Rhode Island put in a real effort to make sure that we had a good showing in the census, and it showed. We were able to show enough people in the census to retain our second congressional seat, and other states, surprising states really, lost seats. In particular, I think of New York that lost by 89 seats. But the interesting thing is that if you want to get into the weeds, after the census is done and the bodies are counted, the Census Bureau has to apportion the seats in Congress in the House of Representatives to the individual states. Every state gets at least one seat, right? So that takes 50 right off the top. There's 385 left. And they have a formula that involves a square root, and it gets a little complicated, but they try to figure out the priority of certain states next to other states. And they figure out a bunch of these priority values, and they compare the states to the states. And eventually through this statistical method, they apportion the rest of those seats into the individual states. That's the 50,000 foot view, but Rhode Island was lucky enough to, make enough to have enough bodies to retain our second district. And down the road, 10 years down the road, when we do this again, we're going to have to put every effort into making sure that we have a good count so that we can hopefully retain that second seat. And who knows, you don't know what happens in 10 years. Maybe we gain population and get a third.
In a nutshell, Rodon gained about 43,000 new residents or additional residents over the last 10 years. So that really helped. That was a big driver of this situation. But Jason Knight, one of your colleagues in the House of Representatives, Representative Carlos Tobon of Pawtucket, he took some kidding a couple of years ago when he had a proposal to offer a stipend to people to move to Rhode Island. He seemed like one of the few people who was actively thinking about the idea of how do we get more population here. So looking ahead, what can our elected officials and our citizens do to try to maintain Rhode Island's political representation into the future and in the next census?
I love Rep. Tobon's enthusiasm for the project of Rhode Island. And that there's no magical formula, right? What Rhode Island has to do to attract people to live here is make this a place that people want to come and stay. And you always hear it, but it's really true. Is this a place that people want to come? Is it a place where they want to raise families? Is this a place where they can build a life? Is this a place where their children can build a life if they happen to stay? Rhode Island needs to be marching down that path every day to improve our schools, to improve our economy, and to maintain the special thing that we have, which is this lovely community right by the ocean. That is so special. I mean, I've lived all over the United States, and Rhode Island it's really unique in terms of the landscape and the environment that we get to live. So we want to keep it clean and pristine, and we want to improve those other aspects so that people come to Rhode Island and decide to set down roots.
Rochelle Lee, we know how the U.S. Constitution requires emphasizing equal population in this process, while the Rhode Island Constitution adds geographical compactness to the criteria for drawing districts. Common Cause is backing a bill that would add legislation to include a number of other criteria to ensure consideration of racial and language minorities, as well as communities of interest. For the ordinary Rhode Islander, what benefits could we see if this legislation is passed to be included in the state constitution?
Thank you. It's a great question. Let me just sort of back up and toss out a notion or a slogan, which is, but fundamentally, when we talk about voter rights or voter education or apportionment, redistricting, what have you, I think we're trying to get to the caveat of those who are most affected or most impacted by an issue or circumstances should be the people at the forefront of making decisions. And that is part of why underlying all these assumptions is this notion of independent redistricting commissions. And so they kind of go hand in hand. If there's a level of independence and certainly a level of accessibility, when you pay attention to people's language issues, other barriers that may prevent them from either voting, being an active or civic enthusiast, and concerned about the world in general, because there's nothing we do, whether it's economics, education, entertainment, you name it, there's really not much we can do in society without having some kind of greater influence on other stakeholders. So to me, I think this is one tool, one opportunity, one best practice in my mind, in my opinion, I should say. I don't speak for anyone else. I do think that paying attention to those kinds of nuances is an important issue. It doesn't solve all the problems, and you'll hear down the road about, some issues that, don't get solved by those kinds of rules because the odds are not in favor. But I do think that fundamentally, if we believe as a state and as a governing community of legislators or what have you, to include the folks most impacted by issues at the table to be decision makers, I think we're, heading in the right direction.
Rochelle, we know sometimes that good government legislation faces a real uphill battle at the State House. How is the outlook for trying to get the legislature to incorporate some of these concerns that you're talking about, and to give citizens the choice of whether to vote to put this in the state constitution?
That's a great question. I wish I had a good, simple, straightforward, bulletproof answer, but I think it's basically continuing to do the work what we're doing right now. I mean, there's always ebbs and flows of, civic activism, civil rights issues. Clearly we're in another generation with the onset of environmental activists, Black Lives Matter, moms and dads, people feeling like they need to be involved. I don't know if that is if we can afford to put it within a compartmentalized timeline. If we don't win today, then we abandon ship. Personally, I feel like every year we've made inroads on people's either perspectives or their understanding of what the public really wants. So I'm not sure we're going to necessarily, get everything we need to get done this year, but I am very optimistic. We have a progressive caucus at this point. We have other less, probably less voices for African Americans in the State House, but nonetheless a larger group of non-white and people who identify as minorities in the State House, in the legislative body. So those may bode well, I would hope, for us in the long run.
I'll make the observation. We are seeing a more diverse legislature. The state Senate is half female now, and there are more people of color in the legislature than before. So perhaps that'll impact this issue going forward. John Marion, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the information for redistricting, the process of redrawing state legislative lines for state lawmakers, will not be out and about for a couple of months. We often hear the term gerrymandering tossed around in connection with the state redistricting process. Tell us what gerrymandering is and what red flags should people be on the lookout for in terms of racial or political gerrymandering?
Sure, thanks, Ian. So the districts according to the U.S. Constitution, districts for both Congress, and we now have to draw 2 congressional districts. We didn't think we were going to have to. And the state legislatures have to be drawn by the state legislatures. unless the people of the state, through their constitution, give that power to somebody else. In Rhode Island, we haven't given that power to somebody else, so it stays with the state legislature. They, historically, the last 30 years, have created a commission that is a mix of members of the state legislature and so-called public members. And that group makes recommendations to the legislature as a whole, but it's the legislature that has to vote on a bill that is the final say in where the district boundaries are. The process of drawing those districts is often controversial. And as you said, there's this term gerrymandering, and it has some Rhode Island connections. So it was a Massachusetts politician who was responsible for the name, but he had Rhode Island relatives. So if you go to Rhode Island Hospital, the old building there, the old Gothic building, is called the Gerry House, and that is his family. And he still has family up in Marblehead, Massachusetts. But the term is often used pejoratively to refer to two things. One is taking racial minorities and either splitting them up or packing them together into districts in order to disenfranchise them. The other is partisan gerrymandering, which is taking folks of a similar political party and either packing them all together or splitting them up to reduce their power. And racial gerrymandering is subject, can be ruled unconstitutional under the Voting Rights Act, the federal courts have said. But in a case that Common Cause brought to the US Supreme Court 2 years ago, the US Supreme Court said that it's a political question, partisan gerrymandering, and that the courts, the federal courts, won't touch it. And the way you see partisan gerrymandering is essentially if one party sort of insulates itself from election results. So the best example is in Wisconsin. Democrats in Wisconsin could win a majority, a big majority of the votes for state legislative seats, but the way the Wisconsin districts are drawn, it would be almost impossible for them to win the majority of the seats. So essentially the minority party in terms of votes insulated itself from the popular will. And that's what can happen at its worst with partisan gerrymandering. And Democrats do it too, but Republicans have sort of mastered the art in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin and so forth.
Ray Rickman, as a former state representative, explain to us the concepts of cracking and packing as it comes, as what they mean in terms of redistricting and how they were used in the Olneyville section of Providence.
Let me, there are thrilling things, and we don't always have the memory to remember. No one Black could get elected to the General Assembly, House or Senate, before the 1980s. And Max Ristow and others, ACLU, were involved. Common Cause was on the edge in getting the legislature into court and then getting a decision to not draw, this is after the 1980 census, not to draw the districts the way they had done. And what the legislature would do, and I'll use South Providence because that's where the decisions were made. They go to the middle of South Providence and cut it into pie-shaped districts, running into Cranston and all kinds of places. And the Black population, which was the majority in South Providence, would be 20-30% in each state rep district. And basically this was to protect people who'd had the seats for the last 10-20 years. And that got dropped and the districts were redrawn, and Charles Walton, first Black in that century, was elected and got to go to the Senate. And in the House, same thing happened. As it was just mentioned, there are a dozen people of color in the General Assembly now. And all of that goes back to the 80s. So the Democratic Party, which has been in charge since the mid-1930s, practiced racial discrimination against people of color. And the Latino community was small 25, 30 years ago and not much affected because they weren't here. The Democratic Party no longer does that, practice racism. But let me say, having served twice on these commissions, 20 years ago and 10 years ago, and this isn't, a lot of people don't like when I say this, but I sat there and I watched. And the population drives the majority of what goes on. The population had grown in South County and all the districts needed to move north. It was simple as that. Now, this is going to be very interesting when September comes and we know where all the 38, 40,000 new people are, because that will drive, Little Compton will, has its 6,000 people. What's going to happen? In Providence, I'm worried because, again, if we pick up 10,000 people, all the lines need to change. And do they go into suburbia more? Or do they contract and stay more in Providence? So I think what is needed is to have a person or persons in the room where it happens. And I think basically both of the parties, Republicans don't have a lot of clout. For instance, they get 2 seats in the Senate and 2 in the House. So there's 6 state senators and 6 state reps. And the Republicans, even though there are only 5 members in the Senate, they get 2 seats. So I think that's going to offer protection because you're in the room, you can complain, you can share, you can tell, you can yell if you need to. I have a list of 11 BIPOC organizations. I started talking to them last week about keeping an eye on this. I talked to leadership of the House yesterday morning, and they have agreed that there will be 1 or more of the 3 public members will be of color. And there will also be at least 1 or more of the legislators to be of
Right.
color.
Let me hold you
So
there.
I think,
Ray.
and I'll start my comment.
Rochelle,
Yeah.
Lee, many people have heard about the gerrymandering controversies involving the state prison, the adult correctional institutions in Cranston, which have elevated Cranston above Warwick as far as being Rodon's 2nd largest city. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's actually, I want to commend the CLU and all the other activists who keep an eye on this and who've been fighting for this for quite some time. The basic, 101, boiled down version is that, when the prisoners at the ACI are housed at the ACI, the question is, at the moment in time the census is taken, are they considered residents of Cranston? And as you know, they've spoken earlier about each district, in theory should have the same number of people representing, which constitutes equal voice, equal representation. So it seemed pretty kind of like obvious that, people are in prison, they're not necessarily residents of the city. And there are a lot of underlying inequities around that as well. They're certainly, as prisoners, not being represented by Mayor Fong or anyone else who's elected in Cranston. They're not Cranston residents. And typically, when the census is taken, prisoners' addresses of the last known address would be the address where the person's body would be counted. And as we all know, with the demographics of the prison population and just the general issues around poverty, income, and other status, the majority of the folks in the ACI are not likely residents of Cranston. So the lower court agreed, thought that was unfair, and I thought to some extent that would be the end of it. But Mayor Fung and his administration decided to pursue it and ended up with a ruling that essentially says, and I think John is probably a better person to explain the nuances, but essentially said there's nothing illegal about it at this point, nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that. But it does create underlying issues. For example, even in Cranston, if you've got each district is 5,000 people, and you add the 3,000 inmates on to the 3,000, that particular number, basically because 3,000 of those people are not really there, they're not there to be, civically engaged, they're not sending their kids to school, they're not paying taxes. You got 3,000 people with the same amount of clout as 5,000 people. And the reverse would be true in terms of deprivation for the communities where these individuals come from. And then, of course, the caveat that really everybody cares about, which is the appropriation of resources and funds based on, your census population. So if you're not at home when they decide to pass out loaves of bread, you're out of luck.
Okay, all right, Jason Knight, let's talk a little bit about the legislature's 18-member redistricting commission. It seems like this process is always dominated by the legislature. So the people who hold the power in the General Assembly are essentially have a big hand in their own destiny. Is that the best way to do this?
Well, there's lots is probably the wrong word, but there's a few different models for this, and they all have advantages and disadvantages. I have not been through a redistricting. I'm eagerly looking forward to see how this one happens. The bottom line is that the way we do it today, yeah, you're absolutely right. The General Assembly kind of controls the destiny, and there's a real argument about, the people who benefit from the maps making the maps. On the other hand, we're going to have a commission of some kind that's going to be composed of members of the General Assembly on the House side and the Senate and the public. They're going to come together. They're going to run through the state, hold public meetings, accept input. There's 2 or 3 redistricting bills in place right now, and some ideas may be incorporated into others. So the final version of whatever that committee looks like, we don't know yet. But at the end of the day, that commission is going to make some recommendations about some maps, and it's going to have to be voted on by the General Assembly, the House and the Senate. And while the knock always is, right, that the people who benefit the maps are making the maps, on the other hand, the voters have the most direct connection to the decision makers because it is the reps and the senators who are making the maps. And I guarantee you, I can only speak for my district, but I guarantee you, I will hear from my district if those maps look shady in any way, shape, or form. And so we'll be held accountable to our voters. Ian, I think that the days, basically the smoke from the back rooms is slowly but surely coming out of the State House because of the open and transparent process that we have today. In the days of Twitter, you just can't make one of those districts that snakes, along the border of the state or looks funny for somehow. You're going to have to explain yourself, and it's going to be a lot easier for the populace to see what the General Assembly is doing. So while there are disadvantages and there's potential for, as there has been in the past, political activity in the redrawing of these maps, I think that the trend in Rhode Island is towards a more open and transparent process, and that's what I hope to see this time around. You can't take the politics out of politics, it's often said, but you certainly can shine more sunshine on the General Assembly, and that has been happening year after year in greater amounts every year since I got there.
Ray Rickman, your time in the legislature was sometime back in the past, but you were on the Redistricting Commission. How did you wind up on that commission? And did you see efforts to take into account the interests of communities of color and other communities that might not have had robust political representation? Ray, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so, you know, I go all the way back to winning awards from Common Cause 3 years in a row for, you know, being a reformer with Rodney Driver and Patrick Kennedy and others. The Speaker of the House put me on so I could be the, you know, progressive reformer voice. And also, you know, I was a twofer, a person of color. And on that first commission, the hanky-panky was not much. It really wasn't. I think, you know, what happened is after a few people get what they want, there isn't a lot you can do. You're wrong. I think they tried to punish one person, one rep, and that backfired. As Jason just said, you know, even then, 20 years ago, people could look at the maps. There's a map process, and they could come in and see them. And then 10 years ago, you really could come and participate and help draw the maps. And like I said, I think there are better ways of doing this, but I don't think there's a lot of really bad things that happen. And I think, and again, as Jason said, I think every 10 years is better. And will it ever be perfect? No. And I think, and I want to repeat, because I've been doing my calls, I think we're going to be happy with the number of people of color who are participating. Remember, people keep forgetting Rhode Island's 24% minority. And we ought to be in every room on every public decision, particularly how the districts are drawn.
Rochelle Leak, perhaps the most notorious recent example of gerrymandering in Rhode Island came in 2002 with an issue involving two African-American senators, Harold Metz and Charles Walton. Tell us about that and their fight to uphold the Voting Rights Act in Senate District 6, please.
Not to sort of belabor the point, because we did touch on it a little bit earlier in places, but fundamentally, you know, the issue of strategizing and trying to uphold the 14th Amendment, which guarantees the right to participate in electoral politics and civic life, equal to in the same excess as everyone else. Sometimes, as Ray said, sometimes the numbers don't work out, the demographics don't work out. And I think that's really something that is a future as well as a past concern. It may be a bit of a wrinkle going forward, because right now, basically, African-American BIPOC communities are all concentrated in one somewhat concentrated side of town that has grave underlying issues beyond politics, which is, you know, housing, education, schools, what have you, concentration of poverty. But I think that the story then was, you know, trying to protect, or at least find a way to ensure that there would be at least one voice in the assembly, and that in this case was a deal. I wouldn't. That's a bad word, but a process that people agreed upon. Ray was part of that process. A couple other residents, some community activists for sure, from both the Latino side of the community as well as the African American, and essentially studied the demographics. It's like, where would we get enough African American votes, or votes of, you know, of similar interests and similar concerns, if we just made squares and went strictly by boxes and contiguous districts. So we ended up with a district that really is kind of crazy looking. It's South Side and community of interest in Mount Hope area. And that's been the system for the last two census eras. I'm not sure what will happen in the future, but good news is that in general, it's not unlikely that an African American or a BIPOC person can be elected in a predominantly white community. And I would imagine at some point there would be the same lack of concern in this the same concern, I should say, to make sure voices are heard regardless of where your zip code is.
John, Marion, we know how technology and culture has changed a lot over the last 20 years. At the same time, I know the former chief of staff for former speaker, Nicholas Mattiello, always had the state's redistricting consultant, Kim Brace, on speed dial. I would expect it's the same with the new House leadership. So how does, in the battle of wits of redistricting, how does, open source technology, the ability of citizens to draw districts and manipulate data, how does that compare against the control of insiders over what has traditionally been their process?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So there's a funny story. There was a particularly bad gerrymander in 1980 after that census where the Senate Majority Leader wanted to stick it to a dissident Democrat on the east side of Providence. And so he moved his district all the way north up into North Providence across the north end of Providence from the east side. And it was revealed that the districts were being drawn by the Speaker of the House's college roommate, who had never had no experience drawing maps. After that, the state faced a lawsuit that it lost, and it hired a consultant, and it hired a guy named Kim Brace in 1983 to clean up the mess. And it's hired Kim Brace ever since. This will be his, fourth or fifth cycle of redistricting, and he's already been hired. And he ushered in the era of using computers to map. So in 1980, they were literally physically using pen or pencil on paper maps. But they started using computers, but those computers were very expensive and computationally heavy. And so the people drawing the maps officially had the advantage, and the public was left just to see the product and point to funny shapes and cry foul. But what's happened, particularly in the last 10 years, is technology has become really cheap. So everybody's heard about the cloud and Amazon Web Services. So you could actually draw a map on your phone right now at the census block level, which is the most granular data we're going to get in September. And so what can happen this time, and this is the title of what the League of Women Voters is promoting, is people-powered fair maps. People can draw their own maps, right? So, and then take them to this commission and say, this is what my community looks like. You don't get to say what my community looks like. I get to say what my community looks like. And so Common Cause, the League, will be holding trainings in the coming months about how to use these tools. But that's one of the things I keep putting in the chat, these bills that Common Cause has and the League supports. We want the commission to have to take those maps. And when the commission produces their official maps, we want them to have to make the underlying data set public immediately, because there are actually tools that will allow us to take their maps, upload it, and within a minute, say whether or not there's a partisan gerrymander in that set of maps. It's called Plan Score. If you go to planscore.org, you will see that tool. All you need is the data file. So that's what we want the legislature to give us. We want the legislature, we're not taking it out of their hands at this point, but we think if it's in their hands, they need to accept the public's maps and they need to make the data from their maps public.
Jason Knight, what do you say about that? You hear John Marion saying the public should have an opportunity to present its maps. Will there be public hearings as the legislature moves forward with its own redistricting commission? And will it take into account the views of citizens who think they have a better approach?
I love John Marion and Common Cause. I always learn something whenever I'm in the same room with him. I think that I want to shift back to the view where I can see everyone. Certainly the commission is going to take public testimony and take public input. I'm not, the commission, whatever it looks like, hasn't even been created by legislation yet. So we're waiting that. I don't have any, I think it's important to say I'm not going to as far as I know, not going to sit on it. There's, because it's not created yet. But I would want to see the commission accept the input from the public. And if the public has maps that they think the commission ought to consider, then I think the commission ought to be able to see them. In terms of turning over the data set, I'm no expert, but I'm a big fan of sunshine. And I think we ought to let the sunshine into state government so that anything that I can see with my own eyes as an elected official, everyone else should be able to see, so that we know the data and everyone knows the data that we are making a decision on. That would be my preference.
Let's go first to Rochelle Lee on this question, and then Ray Rickman. How can citizens and communities of color and other people who perhaps have felt left out of the process, how can they make their voices effectively heard in this redistricting issue?
Speak up. It's just that simple. But they need to know about it, and they need to be invited and encouraged and respected once they're in the process. I think I want to go back to earlier comment that fundamentally this is all about a notion that politicians shouldn't elect who they shouldn't decide who are the political folks. It should be up to residents and the taxpayers and the citizens of the state to decide who their politicians are. But with this system we have right now, which is pretty political and pretty, points of power, it's very, very close. I mean, there's not much to say other than the legislators will be making the final decision. It's not much to say that the speaker and other people in power will have a lot of influence. And so it's important that we have good people like Representative Knight and others who've been fighting out here for some time to, take an honorable and transparent approach to these kinds of very, very significant and serious decisions. But there are a lot of great projects out there at this point. I would say, though, it's like a building block or scaffolding. I don't know what the term would be, but if people don't vote, they won't be involved. I think the work we've done over the last year and a half or 2 years to get people to vote, to get people out to care about political campaigns has been amazing. And it's also important that we build on it. And things like in between elections, understanding how elections are governed leads to how our districts determined. The Georgia Project's got some great stuff going on. The youth projects, we've got a group of kids right here at Rise that have been, in and out of court trying to sue for, social justice and civics education, which ultimately is all one, piece of the pie when it comes to electoral politics. I'm hoping that our leadership that we have right now in the State House and in cities and towns will be part of that process. And just as we begged and begged people to take the census, I think we mustn't let up on continuing to appeal to people to stay involved and not discourage them, because you get there and you find out that they're not listening to you. That's a non-starter, shall we say.
Ray Rickman, are there groups and coalitions that people should know about that can help to amplify their voices on these kinds of issues?
No, I think every single person who is deeply interested in this should call the leadership of the Senate and the House and say, appoint me. Ask to be appointed. There are citizens both from the House and the Senate, I'm sorry, that will be appointed. And this very morning, I recommended 2 people to the Speaker's staff that they think about them. And who are strong. If they're in the room, they will be strong. And that's one of the things we have to do. I believe this about the entire system in America. It's awkward, it's old, it's stale. A lot of it was created in 1905, right down to the YMCA, everything. And that's what's wrong. We're always starting from what we have, and we're trying to fix it or mend it. I would love to see Common Cause and League of Women Voters to put forth a model, and it's too late this year, but a way that we might do this differently than just trying to make a bad system work well. Let me say this final thing. The bills will get voted on by June. I understand that there'll be meetings. The commission's members will be appointed immediately. They'll meet late this summer. Because the census is late, they will have to put a bill before the General Assembly in January. So the time is now.
All right. Jason Knight, you've worked with Common Cause on some redistricting reform issues. How were those issues received in the past by House leadership? And now that there's new leadership in the House with Speaker Shikarchi, does that change things at all?
Well, I just want to echo what Ray said. What I attempted to do with a previous bill was to introduce a different way of doing things, which it would have created a citizens redistricting committee that would have been made up of people just, subject to a couple of concerns drawn from a hat and no politicians. The only person involved in the process would have been the Secretary of the State as the person drawing the lots out of the hat. That was based on a California model, and I think it would have been an interesting idea. But change comes hard and it comes slow. And that was, there really wasn't a reception for it in the year that I put in. Speaker Shikarchi is a different speaker than Speaker Mattiello. I think he's committed to his term as speaker of running a member-driven House, and he's been true to his word right up until today. So I can't tell you what he's going to do, but I have high hopes for a transparent process this time around, and perhaps a couple of changes. But I think it's worth saying, politics is always like politics is often driven in is often driven by a demand for change, and the people who want the most change tend to be the loudest. Now I'm going to put my lawyer hat on here for a minute, so just bear with me, everyone. But there is value in stability and predictability in the law, and so when we change, we should change incrementally and in a thoughtful fashion. Sometimes you have to rip the Band-Aid off, and it is what it is because people are hurting. But in technical areas like this, I think that there's value in sort of taking a careful approach and working towards a goal. Not to say you should slow foot it, but you got to be careful, right? Because you're going to end up at the end of the day with a legislative product that you have to live with for the next 10 years. So I hope that everyone who's appointed to this commission really takes it seriously, really digs in, and does their best for the people of Rhode Island to create equal and proportionate representation across the board, consistent with the best values of reapportionment. And now I'm going to take my lawyer hat off and say, I hope Speaker Shikarchi is listening tonight and take some of my advice.
John, Marion, some people might make the observation that redistricting happens at once every 10 years. The process has already been established. Is it too late to really make a significant impact, or is there an opportunity to make a big impact here in Rhode Island?
Yeah, so I kind of stepped on this question in my earlier remarks, but there certainly is time to affect change. So you've heard a couple of times that the bill to create this commission has not passed yet. The House version had its hearing 2 weeks ago. The Senate version, or 3 weeks ago, the Senate version was only introduced 2 days ago and hasn't had a hearing yet. So people can show up for those hearings. They can find out that information from us at Common Cause or the League. They can reach out to their state reps and senators. So I put in the chat some information about our bill. And if you go to that website that I put in the chat a couple of times, there's actually a petition, and that petition then gets sent to your reps and senators, telling them you support change. The other thing, though, is once the bill passes, that's not the end of the process by any means. That's really only the beginning. You can go to these public meetings that you're hearing about that are going to take place. There were 28 of them last cycle. And you can speak up and you can say, this is what I think my community looks like. I don't think it should be split up. I think it should be kept as a whole. And you can draw maps using the tools I put in the chat. There's a great tool, and we've worked with the developer. It's called District R, as in the word district, just the letter R.org. One of the developers is a proud classical high grad from Providence, and you can draw maps today, and that has the 2010 data in there. It doesn't have the 2020 data up yet. You can draw maps of the state or the city of Providence in there right now, and we'll get that 2020 data in there as soon as it becomes available. So you can draw maps and bring them to this commission and demand that they pay attention to those maps.
We're coming up on the 1 hour mark, and I think our Zoom might time out shortly. So this will be my last question to John Marion. Are there any bigger structural changes that you would recommend to redistricting as people look to the future and getting out further ahead of the process?
Yeah, so as Representative Knight said, we had a bill to make a constitutional change, and that's really the way to affect who draws the lines. And that is going to take years to build the power to get that through, as they did, in Arizona and California, where they took it out of the hands of the politicians and put it into neutral parties' hands. So you can go to that redrawri.org website. That was the proposal we had before. That's similar to the proposal we'll probably put forward after this cycle is over. And I will make one more plug, which is we partner with the League and 26 other organizations to work on voting rights. This is all about drawing districts so then people can vote. But if people can't vote, it doesn't matter about the districts. And we are working on a campaign called Let RI Vote. And I'm putting it in the chat. And as I said, there's 27 organizations involved in this, and there's legislation active right now that we're trying to get passed to enhance early voting, to give greater access to mail ballots as we had during the pandemic and so forth. So you can check that out. There's a petition that's that close to having 1,000 signatures on it. So you can be the 1,000th person to sign that tonight if you want.
All right, that's almost as good as the low number license plate in Rhode Island. I'd like to thank our excellent panel, John Marion from Common Cause, State Representative Jason Knight, community activist Rochelle Lee, and former state rep and community activist Ray Rickman. I'm Ian Donnis. I'd also like to thank Common Cause of Rhode Island and the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this discussion. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope you found it worthwhile.
Thank you all.